So on to another topic. We are seeing the first federal court ruling on coronavirus vaccine mandates. A federal judge recently tossed out a lawsuit brought by the staff at Houston Methodist over its requirement that workers be vaccinated against the virus. In his ruling, the judge said that the hospital's requirement does not violate federal law or public policy. Houston Methodist suspended more than 100 employees without pay for failing to comply for 14 days. Their attorneys say despite the ruling, they will continue to fight back and plan to file another lawsuit. So Richard Roth is with us now to discuss. He's an employment attorney. And Richard will point out that, this lawsuit is just one. I think there are other lawsuits across the country challenging the same thing, an employer mandating that people become vaccinated. On what grounds did the court uphold the hospital's policy?
So the bottom line is that every employee is an employee at will, and employers can do really whatever they want, barring a violation of what's called statutorily protected rights, which would be doing something to that person because of age, ethnicity, religion, nationality, disability. So the court basically said that if an employer wants to have you actually take a vaccine, they have a right to do it. So there really was no ground upon which to start that lawsuit. So the court threw it out, saying that it was fictitious. And not only that, but the lawsuit claimed that the vaccine was this poison. It was really went over the top. But at the end of the day, the employer has a right to do what it wants, when it wants, with regard to employees, except for, as I said, the statutorily protected rights. And that's essentially what the court did.
So to just put it in simpler terms, Mr. Roth, if, for example, an employer says you cannot wear shorts to work, that's against company policy. Are we talking about more or less the same thing? I mean, they can tell you what you can wear, what you can't wear, unless it's something that violates your religious affiliation. You can, if you want a job here, you can't wear shorts, you can't wear sweatpants, you can't wear flip-flops. And if you do, then we can fire you. Is that how it goes?
Same thing. Exact same thing. So that's right. But if you say, I want women to wear short skirts, now you're talking about treating women differently, but you can't wear shorts. You must wear a suit. You must wear a black outfit. You must wear whatever it is. You must appear at a certain time. You must leave at a certain time. There are the employers are given a lot of latitude, and there's a reason for it. The reason is, could you imagine how filled up the courts would be if every time there's some kind of a alleged violation that an employee would sue? So it really frees the courts up, and it makes sense. It makes sense. So yes, it's exactly the same thing. You can't wear shorts to the office. You can't wear flip-flops. That's essentially what the courts are saying.
Can I just ask you, Mr. Roth, one of the things that when I was traveling abroad recently, I was talking to somebody who was a general manager of an institution, and he said, well, one of the considerations in Europe is, let's say somebody is told that they must be vaccinated and they get sick from the vaccine. Does that leave the employer open to a lawsuit because the only reason that the person took the vaccine was because their employer told them to take it?
Yeah, it doesn't. In this country, it does not leave the employer potentially liable for any lawsuit. The only tweak to the answer is no. The only tweak to the requirement that you're vaccinated is that an employer must allow you to get a vaccine. They can't say you have to be here during all hours and not allow you to get there. Or if you can't, you have to travel to get there. They may have to help you, especially for the disabled. But at the end of the day, no. If they tell you have to take a vaccine and you get sick, it's unfortunate, but the employer cannot be held liable.
So, a lot of us, especially if you sort of grew up in this country, have gotten vaccines all along the way. In order to go to school, you have to get vaccines and so on and so forth. But once you become an adult and you're sort of applying for jobs, no one ever asks you, are you vaccinated for XYZ? Did you get the MMR vaccine when you were a kid or whatever? So right now we're talking about, people who are currently employed and their employer has introduced a new job requirement that wasn't there when they accepted the job initially. But if you're looking for a job and you're, going through the process, can an employer ask you, to get a vaccine or ask you if you've received the vaccine?
Yeah, they can. They can ask you if you got a vaccine, and they can actually ask you to show proof of it. It's absolutely allowable. There are certain things that are not allowed, like whether you've been incarcerated. whether you had a felony. But in every state, you can actually say, listen, I'm only hiring vaccinated people. No different than I'd have a vaccination section in a sporting event, and you have to show proof of vaccine. So yeah, there's a lot of latitude.
So do you have to answer? Because, you know, there are often questions on applications that you're not required to answer, like your race. Do you have to answer that question?
So you don't have to answer, but they don't have to hire you. So if you want the job, the recommendation is answer that question. This is not, again, dealing with something race, religion, ethnicity. So yeah, if you want the job, you have to answer.
It's so interesting because it's an optional answer, but if you don't answer it, you probably won't get the job. So, but they can't make it a requirement, right? It's still considered optional, even though technically it's required.
That's correct. It's like you said, optional, meaning that you have to do it if you want the job. It's pretty simple. And again, there's a reason behind it, which is essentially the same reason the court rendered when it agreed with it when it rendered its decision.
So then what if you are already, to take Anne-Marie's example, at the next step? So let's say you're already employed at a company, and now they say, look, as we come out of this pandemic, we want to ensure that everybody's vaccinated. Can they check to see, because people can say whatever they want, the question becomes, can the employer verify your vaccination, and how would they do that? Would you have to present your vaccine card? So how would that affect? Because right now, for example, you go to the gym and it's on the honor system, right? They say if you're fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask and you can move about the gym freely and do whatever you want. So you are assuming that everybody is vaccinated if they're not wearing a mask, but human nature being what it is, I'm not so sure half the time. So what about here in the workplace?
Yeah, you're right. There is a big honor system in a lot of different arenas, one of which is the gyms. But in the workplace, they can ask you, no different than if they want to say, listen, we want a security check. We want to fingerprint you, employers can do. We want to do a check to make sure you haven't had any prior history, criminal history. We want to, blood test is something that they can actually do as well. Again, so long as they're uniform across the board, they can say, I want to see your vaccination. I want to see your card. I know you say you were vaccinated, show me proof, and the employee may have to show it. Just like when you start a job now in this country, you have to show you're a U.S. You have to show you're a U.S. resident. You have to show your employer your passport. So yes, there's a tremendous amount of latitude given to employers.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is sort of interesting too is, and I have not thought of this because this is not something that sort of would have impacted my life until COVID-19, and I don't have children. But you pointed out that, for example, when you go to school, you have to receive a certain number of inoculations and vaccinations, and it even is the case when you go to college. So in other words, before you're 18, you have to go to school. After 18, you choose to go to school, and if you choose to go to a university, they will say, you need to have these vaccinations if you're going to be living on campus. No one's ever really questioned that, as far as I know. I mean, not to the scale that we're seeing right now. So in that situation where the school is now saying, even though you're paying us to receive this education, we can still ensure that you're vaccinated, that rule has never been challenged, right? And I'm guessing it's a little different than the rule of employers, or is it not?
It's different. It's different to the extent they're not an employer. They're, if you will, an institution, either higher institution of learning or what have you, but it's the same principle. If they want you to show that you've been vaccinated, then you must show you've been vaccinated. And the interesting thing about this is that it actually is, all science is leading to the conclusion that vaccinations are helpful, and they want to reach the 70 to 80%. And so all of these policies are actually going to get us there. For the people that don't want to be vaccinated, they may say, well, you know what? If I want to get that job, if I want to go to that school, I better do it. So they have a right, schools have a right to say you must be vaccinated before you come to class. There's a tremendous policy which essentially allows for those in power, whether it be an employer or an institution, higher education or otherwise, to mandate certain requirements for the safety of the public.
But Richard, even when it comes to schools, there are sometimes exceptions or exemptions made. We've done stories on like the resurgence of like the measles or something because, you know, a large group of parents choose not to have their kids vaccinated. So I'm wondering in the workplace, when must exemptions be made or reasonable accommodations be made? If someone says, look, I mean, is there such a thing as saying I have a really good reason for not wanting to be vaccinated?
Absolutely. Great question. So if in fact you have a scientific medical fear that a vaccination can somehow result in have negative repercussions, then you have to essentially tell your employer and have a doctor's note or a doctor's report, explain to the employer, I have the following symptoms, I have the following ailment. A vaccination could result in could have a very negative consequences. So if you have that, generally speaking, that should be good enough, so long as the doctor signs something that says that. So that would be the only exception. And that does happen. There are people out there that are very afraid of getting vaccinations for medical reasons. So if there's a legitimate medical reason, employers will probably carve you out. They don't have to, but they generally will carve you out and say, listen, I now understand that your doctor presented to me a document which says that a vaccination could harm you or kill you. I'm not going to require you get vaccinated. But it's got to be a pretty strong letter from the doctor explaining the reason and why the vaccination should not.
Richard, I know you got to run in just a minute, but real quick, what happens if the unions get involved? Now we're talking a group of employees, a large group of employees that work in a particular industry, and the union decides to go toe-to-toe with management. What could that mean?
It's interesting. I don't think they will, but if there's a collective bargaining agreement that essentially provides that an employer cannot demand a vaccination, then that will go to the courts. And again, I think the court will do the same thing they did with the most recent decision in Texas. I think the court will say, no, if an employer wants you to be vaccinated, you must be vaccinated.
Fascinating discussion. Richard Roth, please come back and talk to us. I think we're going to need a lot more employment stories because this is really an interesting aspect of the law. So we appreciate your time.
It really is. It really is. Thank you so much.
Thank you.